Okay, so your recent innovation execution report, I think you carried out in association with Professor Fengley. It suggests there's a number of significant obstacles in terms of companies being able to innovate or implement innovation successfully. So perhaps we can have a look at some of those sort of obstacles that highlighted, and I guess one place to start with, skills, stroke, a wider sort of digital knowledge. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so, I think we talked about the skills gap before when we did this, in previous years, and it was really sort of revisiting that and seeing if the space had changed at all. And, that there is some evolution in the space, but the story is still broadly the same. The main thing is that when you look at it, I mean, I suppose the biggest problem is about 3/4 of people actually were saying that their businesses are struggling to unlock the value of their data, which is directly impacting their ability to innovate, and I think that's it. We're a very innovative company here at VMware, and innovation is at the core of what we do and where we've come from and where we're going. I suppose it's the foundation for us, especially in the office the CTO where I work, which is all about innovation. And so for us, it's unlocking the ability to innovate is huge. So going and talking to customers and saying, well, their ability to change dramatically, their ability to do anything new or exciting is limited by a few things. I mean, the other one was that about 1/3 of the business leaders are citing cost reduction as their sort of #1 strategic objective. And of course, that ends up being a bit of a problem, obviously, in terms of how you look at innovation. But I think when people say, okay, fine, cost reduction is important, well, you've got to probably think that actually innovation is the area you have to reduce cost in the least, because that's the one that's going to help you reduce cost as well, I suppose. I think people, quite often hit some of the areas that might actually enable them to change the business as they shrink back, and as these threats of recessions loom and all the other things that are going on in the press at the moment. So maybe better utilization of their data could be a better way to deal with that. And then when they look around their peers, nearly, I think it's 59-60% of them believe that organizations who are prioritizing this sort of data-led decision making are stealing market share, and there's this constant fear of falling behind the competition. So there's definite focus, I think, if you wanted to put a broad brush on it, of people basically saying, I don't think we're using our data enough, I don't think we're getting enough out of it, I don't think we're spending enough time focusing on innovating around what we can do with our data, and more importantly, other people are doing better than us. But then I think you always think other people are doing better than you, don't you? So
yeah, and in terms of that sort of disjoint, if you like, not doing enough with the data, sort of lack of skills might be one thing. I'm also thinking, I know companies are trying to transform and become more collaborative, but are we still suffering a little bit from departments, that sort of siloed mentality? So therefore, they're not getting the overall benefits because everyone's kind of doing their own thing. Is that fair to say?
Oh, totally. I mean, it's very interesting. I think I'm going to have to come up with a law, if I ever go down in history, as Baguley's law, is that any conversation I have about technology always ends up being about people and process. And any meeting you have in an IT organization always ends up with someone saying, well, we could do all that fantastic technological stuff if we didn't have all these people and process things standing in the way. And, when you talk about silos, that's a fantastic example. Those silos are very rarely created by technology. They're created by organizations, by people and process. And so, when we look at how to solve that, I strongly advise people looking at people process along with technology to sort of start to bridge that gap between the way they've got any ideas and getting tangible impact from those ideas. It's always people and process that stands in the way.
And also, we can't really talk about data, which I know we're going to come on to a bit more, but with data sovereignty and compliance, and again, I mean, it's a massive topic, and clearly legislation changes all the time, etc. Do you think it's a bit of a red herring to use it as an obstacle, because a lot of people don't really understand what it is, so they take a very safe approach to say, oh, well, we can't do that, even when you probably can do it? Or what's your view? Because I say, it seems to me that a lot of people think, oh, we better just keep our data here, in the office, or within the company, just because it's a bit dangerous if we let it loose in the cloud, or abroad or something like that. Whereas there aren't often rules preventing that. You just have to do your due diligence and understand where your data is. What do you think?
I think that's it. I mean, how many times in your daily life do you have someone say, oh, well, we can't do that because of data protection, when it's quite clear that person has never read or knows anything about data protection, they're just making it up. So, I think there's a lot of fallacies, myths and untruths in the space around data and data sovereignty, as you point out. I think the challenge is that organizations are naturally risk averse. That's what you tend to be. And the people who are in charge of looking after and being the guardians of that, typically security organizations, lawyers, etc., within the business, are also very risk averse. I think there's opportunity around seeing what the rules actually are and working within those boundaries, for sure. I think we're seeing a world where the problem is data sovereignty and cloud sovereignty is still a bit of a wild west at the moment. You know, ourselves and other companies are kind of helping to define that, but the problem is there's a mishmash of terms. People talk, use the same terms to mean different things. A lot of people talk about cloud sovereignty. They're actually meaning data sovereignty, or even data locality, or whether data's physically located or who can have access to it. So I think maybe some people are missing out on opportunities by probably being a little bit afraid of where they put their data. But equally, we're not very helping very much as an industry by not making it very clear to some organizations, what those rules are and how we can help in that. So I think you're starting to see some changes. We're obviously making some changes in that space at VMware, but I think there's a long way to go in the industry around enabling businesses and lay people to better understand that the opportunities available to them without the scaremongering of, well, I can't have my data in that cloud, or I can't put my data there, or the Americans might be able to see it, or whatever, which is what we hear a lot in Europe. So yeah, it's a very valid point. But it's, I think when we look at the results, the study, it came up as a massive concern. Sort of national, 76%, or industry at 67% of directives highlighted significant barriers to realizing the value of data. And I wonder how many people there actually properly understood what those barriers are, and whether they could do that or not, or they're just going, it's just too hard because of data sovereignty.
And overall, are you surprised, bearing in mind what you said earlier, and generally the acceptance that better data, more data to a certain extent leads to better business outcomes, and conversely, if you don't really have a handle on your data, you're going to be potentially suffering commercially. Are you perhaps surprised that people haven't done more? I know there's a bit of a hype around big data stuff, but fundamentally it seems a lot of organizations have yet to come to grips with the benefits that doing data properly, if that's the right way of putting it, can bring.
I think, a bit of a hype around big data is a bit of an understatement. We've had a hype around big data for over a decade now, I think, haven't we? It's been about big data and data lakes and data warehouses, and data lake houses was another one I read the other week. It's getting, it's a very messy area. I think when people are looking at that, again, there's a massive skills problem there, because I think a lot of organizations we talk to recognize that they have a lot of data, or could have access to a lot of data that could be useful and provide insights on how they can innovate and change and do something better or improve. But I think they're just missing the ability to even get into that. So it's almost, where do you start with that? And I think if you look at any reasonable size organization, even small to medium sized businesses, it's almost outside their grasp. I mean, where are they going to hire a data scientist from? Where are they going to get that kind of insight from? So they're really looking to, an industry to provide more, I think, basic tooling for them to be able to aggregate their data sets and get some kind of sense out of it. I think it's a really important point.
Okay, so do you think therefore that, I get the impression that the data industry is encouraging people to buy software solutions and do it themselves, but it sounds as if you're suggesting maybe that the more efficient way for a lot of organizations who don't have the in-house skills is to look to a third party to at least help them on that journey, if not actually do the heavy lifting for them.
Yeah, and there's a huge range of opportunity out there for them in the industry, and I think the rise of cloud has made that a lot easier for people in terms of having SaaS offerings and software. Rather than having to go and install huge things themselves and build their own data warehouses and data lakes, they can take advantage of cloud offerings to do that. And I think we'll see an increase in that as we go forward. I think again you've got to balance that with people being concerned about putting all their data in one cloud and then how they get that data back out of the cloud and put it somewhere else in the future. One of the calls I've been having this morning was with the EU around the new Data Act and how that's going to be impacting, and they're asking for advice from ourselves and other companies around and service providers around how that's going to actually make a difference for them. So there's a definite concern with people when they say, okay, fine, well, if I do put all my data in one of these clouds and then suddenly I decide I'm being overcharged or whatever reason, I want to get out of that data, you get cloud and get somewhere else, and how do I do that? I think that's so it's always balancing this. If I went and used this stuff, it could be really cool, I could get some amazing stuff, but then what if I then find I'm trapped spending a lot of money tied to a subscription that I can't get out of, or just can't get my data out of. So I think we're looking again to legislators to provide provision, to provide reassurance to customers. I think that they can go into these engagements and properly not feel like they're going to be trapped, I suppose, really.
And in terms, I mean, everyone assumes and talks about, you know, the major benefits, but in terms of those, you know, the reality of that, we're talking about sort of within the organization, sort of workforce productivity, for example, and perhaps the major benefits is always put out there. You know, the customer experience is going to be infinitely better.
Yeah.
You know, if the data is used. Again, are we guilty of a slight overhype there, or is it really true that, you know, if you do use your data intelligently and wisely, you can, if not transform your business, at least, you know, significantly enhance, you know, the profitability, etc., of what you're doing?
There's a whole host of ways that, I mean, you could think about that customer service could be improved by using data. I think that there's a very delicate line. There's a couple of ways, there's a couple of things to think about in this area, actually. There's a very delicate line. I remember the kids game, What's the Time, Mr. Wolf? You used to see how close you used to get to someone. There's that same thing from a consumer perspective, where with a consumer, what you're doing is you are willing to volunteer personal data about yourself to get a better level of service, for example. But at some point, it's going to get a little bit spooky when that service seems to know a little bit too much about you and start recommending things. So there's this, you know, there's this constant dance around where's the personal space sit with regards to consumer and the provider of the service. And I think that comes across to anyone. So I think that's a delicate balance and a dance that people have got to make when they start to use this data from a privacy perspective, and from a, you know, how much data should people, you know, be giving up, and how much data should you be using about them. I think, again, if you think of that from a corporate perspective and switch it to, okay, fine, well, let's look around the workforce and productivity. There's a lot that could be done in terms of just the systems themselves and how they're provided to that workforce and how they could better be used. You know, when you're looking at providing people with the whole point about being an IT, let's just put this into it. The whole point about being an IT is to make sure that whoever it is works for your company has the right applications, the right data accessible to the right time to do their job, whatever that is. If they're a postman using a handheld scanner device, if they're, you know, a doctor going around with an iPad, making sure they've got all the data relevant to them on that patient. The focus of you in IT has to be able to make sure that that data is there at the right time and secure and in their hands, etc. And so you can use data to make that better. I mean, we look at how we provide workforce solutions where we can actually say, okay, fine, we're going to provide, based on where that, you know, the data on where that device is, where that person usually logs on, can provide me security information. You know, for example, that if that user suddenly logs on in a country they've never logged on from before, or maybe they log on at a time of day they don't usually log on to, then maybe that's a security risk and I need to look at that. But equally, I might be able to pop up and say, well, actually, I now know where they are and what they're doing, so I can automatically provide data relevant to the location they're in, if that's what the job requires. So I think, you know, there's a flip side to all of this. We've got to think about, okay, how can I use data to better improve customer service? And the best way you can do it is make it almost invisible, I suppose, really, I think is the best way. So in both of these scenarios, what you're trying to do is say, okay, how can I use data to make the experience for both my employees and the end customer smoother, easier, much easier to get on with their job? Because typically people's job isn't about using IT, it's about doing something else.
And do you think, to that point, is it, where possible, better to sort of obtain that data? I won't say sort of surreptitiously, but slightly softly, in the sense that if you're actually surveying people and saying, you know, tell us about this, what about this? I mean, you know, again, the general public is perhaps a little bit nervous because every day there's somebody's been hacked or somebody's, you know, database and all the rest. So people are perhaps nervous sharing. So I say, is it where possible better to sort of use the data that you can obtain through sort of, you know, normal interaction, as opposed to, you know, advertising the fact that you want to ask a customer a load of questions? Or how do you balance those two things, do you think?
Well, they're very different things. There's information you're collecting around someone's behavior, and there's information collecting particularly about that you've asked them for, you know, to them to volunteer. And I think, you know, that's always the balance, isn't it? And this is the balance that the large providers, the Googles, the Amazons, the Facebooks are always dancing around, is how much does the user volunteer and how much are you going to obtain about that user by their usage of the information, you know, by the usage of the service, should I say, sorry. And when we look at that from a VMware perspective, you know, we provide workspace solutions for people to go out and, you know, make sure we're properly managing laptops, end user devices, mobile phones, etc., like that. And in an employee context, you know, it's very useful for the organization to understand and model how the user's using their device and when they're using it for the security reasons and other customer service reasons or whatever quality of service reasons I talked about before. But it's important to be explicit with the user when you're helping them with those devices, is they know what's being monitored and managed. I think that's really, really important, you know, and it's one thing that we do when, for example, I get a new mobile phone, as I did the other week with the new iPhone, and I add it into our corporate system, which is just by installing an app and logging in. I get a very simple thing that tells me exactly what the company's going to be seeing and able to see on my device and what they can't see, and how that's going to work. And it's a very clear contract between me and them. And I think that's important in all these situations, because any of this comes down to trust, right? And it's that level of trust that you've got to build with people.
And in terms of the, we mentioned earlier a bit about the sort of hype around this. Do you think it is possible, and if it is, how do you avoid it, for people to actually, keep or store too much data? In the sense that, are we being encouraged that every single, little bit of our lives or business lives has to be logged and stored just in case we might need it in, tomorrow, 5 years time, 10 years time? Is there such a thing as too much data, and if there is, how do you guard against that?
Yeah, most definitely, right? So I remember that the president of Johnson & Johnson, Deborah Bass, once said that this term called info obesity, and that was a long time ago. And there's many organizations do have this info obesity, where it's this obsession with keeping every single piece of data ever, just in case you might need it. And I think, you've got to be very careful there, because what you end up doing is bogging yourself down in data, as we call it, too much data. The point being that, a lot of there's a few things to talk about here around this too much data issue, because it's one I'm quite interested in. The first thing is, there's a really good example. I've got to pull this up on here so the Large Hadron Collider, which is a really good example, that we all know about that out at CERN in Switzerland, where they're doing these, physical modeling, and they, if they wanted to keep all 30 million events per second that they're creating in the Large Hadron Collider, they would need 2,000 petabytes to store a typical 12-hour run, right? So for a typical running year that would mean they'd need 400,000 petabytes, which is just a huge amount of data. It's stupid. So what they actually do, for every 30 million collisions, they only save 1,200 of them. So that's 0.004%, because they know they can get enough data. So they're throwing away 99.996% of the data. And so you think, oh my God, what's in all that they're missing? But they've taken a calculated, they're scientists, I think they know what they're doing, a calculated risk there in knowing that most of that data they won't need, and the bit that's pertinent there. So how do you do that as a business? That's the real challenge, right? You sit there and you go, okay, well, if I'm collecting data from all these devices and everyone doing stuff, how much do I need to collect? So you need to look at things, is that data reliable? Where's it coming from? Is it useful? Is it actually going to be any use to me? Is it authoritative, or is it just garbage? Is it complete? A lot of times partial data can come in, and that makes you, if you've not got the full data set, sometimes, a large amount of partial data is pretty much useless. Also, how relevant is it? How long do we need to keep data is another valid question. Keeping data on a particular device might only be useful for a 3-month, 6-month period. So how long do you have a retention period? And then, also there's the legitimacy of, where could you legally get it? So a really good example of that is also where we look at people having a too much data problem is in facial recognition and other things. So if you think about now, people running facial recognition in stores, which is what they're doing. So some retailers are running facial recognition to see where people are looking and what shops they're, what items they're looking at, how they go in the store. There's absolutely no reason to keep that data. They just want to know person X looked at this, looked at a box of cereal for 30 seconds and moved on. You don't need to keep the full picture and everything else, So it's these intelligent decisions being made at the edge now is the real one, because as we get, into a world of unfeasible amounts of data, we have a network problem. The networks just aren't good enough to start uploading all this data from these edge devices back up the center. So we're now getting to the point where we need to start building AI and machine learning into these edge devices, where they can start to make intelligent decisions about what data to keep and what data to throw away, because there's just no physical way of keeping all that data and streaming it all back up to the center. So this is a necessity. So bottom line is, to answer your question, yes, you can have too much data. Pretty much everyone has too much data. So the real challenge going forward is deciding what data you keep and what data you throw away. And there's increasing techniques and technologies coming out around AI and machine learning to work out what you do with that. And the risk, if you do have too much data, is you can just waste so much time looking at it. I mean, you can literally waste CPU cycles cost exploring a huge data set for get that back out of it, something that you probably need a fraction of that data set to get the same result. And I think that's also, worth worrying about as well.
I suppose back to a point earlier, do you think people are a little bit frightened because, they don't want to be the person to tell the boss that, oh, I deleted that data that you're suddenly interested in? Or do you think if the right processes are in place, enough people will have, okayed the decision to get rid of a pile of data that problem shouldn't arise? I mean, you can't be 100% accurate, but in general.
So if you look at the CERN example, those physicists know which data to throw away because they're very well educated on their data sets and they've built experience on it and they know they don't need it. So, you and I arbitrarily deciding to delete stuff because we think we might not need it, it's probably not the best idea. But having intelligent people that understand and look at the data sets and can make decisions around in future what we keep and what we throw away based on previous insights is really important. I think this comes from the problem is that historically companies only had limited data, right? We had a very small data set. And so we'd look at that information and start mining it. And this has created this bad practice that we have to kind of, just keep all the data because we can mine it. It's that tipping point where an organization goes, do you know what, we don't need to keep everything. And in fact, what we need to do is go through an exercise to work out what we don't keep, because that'll actually make us nimbler, faster, more innovative, and reduce cost, but still be able to make the same level of decisions. And that's a very delicate balance. And it's really interesting to watch the industry sort of, spin around that at the moment. But it's certainly something people need to think about, even in your personal life, we all have it. Do you keep every photo? Do we need to keep every photo you take on your phone? I don't think so, but that's going to be a problem, right?
So you mentioned cost there, because clearly, I mean, there is, at the moment, I mean, storage is relatively inexpensive, but I think, the cost will increase, as you say, keeping petabytes and petabytes for no reason. But do you think also maybe there's a sustainability angle is kicking in or might kick in, that, the companies that are seen to be, if it's ever discovered that they're storing vast amounts of data for no apparently good reason, and therefore, heating up the planet, whatever it is, I mean, do you think that is an argument, or at the moment is that just a little
completely
bit,
totally. I totally and utterly, I think there's a massive argument around that. Cost will drive that, which is a great thing, because obviously storing data and processing data costs money. So hopefully organizations will be driven to reduce that usage based on cost alone. But ESG is something that's going to kick in a huge way in the context of this data storage and data processing, because as we talked about, if you store a large amount of data, you need a huge amount of processing to look at it. You need, big, expensive GPUs. You need, these GPU mining farms to go and have a look at this kind of stuff, and that costs money. So as organizations start to look at their sustainability impact, they need to think, more than twice about, how much data they're going to store and how much it's going to cost them in the long run from both the sustainability and a raw cost perspective. At the same time, just sticking in a data center that's run by renewables isn't the answer, by the way. So a lot of people are doing that. So, well, we're fine because our data center runs on renewables. You're like, well, yeah, but that's like my argument against Bitcoin. Bitcoin is hugely wasteful in what it does. And people go, well, actually, but we use renewables for it. I'm like, well, yeah, but what if those renewables could be used for something else? Are you wasting the use of renewables just because you've decided to store data for longer, or too much data, or process data that's not necessarily to be processed in that way? So yeah, again, it's a really valid point, one that people will need to think about ESG when they look at these data stores. It's going to cost them.
Okay, and is it possible, bear in mind we've covered quite a lot of ground, I mean, is there I know every company will be slightly different, but is it possible to create some kind of best practice, I guess, innovation methodology, but in particular around the data point? Is there a simple checklist of do's or don'ts, or as I say, does it really vary from company to company too much to be able to do that?
I wish there was. I would have written the book by now. If I'm retired. There really isn't. I think this is more about making sure people go into these projects with open eyes and having a much better awareness of what the possibilities are, I think, is the answer here. So no, I'm sorry, this is not me coming out with the answer. VMware doesn't have the answer to all of this either. I think it's more a case of raising awareness of the challenges and making sure that people are, informed in their decision making. I think is the important thing, because it's going to vary way too much. And it's great because there's some fantastic industry initiatives around trying to solve these kind of things. If you look at Gaia-X in Europe is a really good example, where what we're looking at there within a European context, that's GAIA X is an interoperability standard for data at a European and global level, hopefully. So the great example being, Human Genome Project is huge amounts of data going on with that. If we want to share that amongst the scientific community, rather than creating one big central Human Genome Project data pool or copying it all over the place, Gaia-X would give us the ability for each of the owners of data to be able to share data between themselves securely with trust, et cetera, et cetera. And that's going to go across industries. There's manufacturing and other industries spinning up standards around that too. So I think what we're looking at here is starting to see in the industry a realization that data is useful, has a huge value, but more importantly, we need to come up with more intelligent and more efficient ways of sharing and storing data than just creating more copies of it all over the place.
Okay, and in terms of VMware yourselves, I mean, clearly a huge global organization and fingers in, shall we say, very many pies, but in terms of this what I call the data maze, maybe, what is it you can help or are helping customers do, with that? And I mean, I guess I say there's as many different things as customers, but just some idea of your work.
Yeah, I don't want to give a big sales pitch here because that's not what this is about. But, we truly believe that the future for our customer base is multi-cloud. There's a flip and a trend that the trend over the last, God knows how many years, was everything's going to end up in one cloud, pick your cloud. The reality for our customer base and the world is that that's not the case. People are putting stuff in lots of different clouds. So what we're bringing to the table with our multi-cloud solutions is the ability for our customers to have that openness and choice, that ability to freely move between clouds, to freely move data and applications between clouds when they need to, and to build applications that span multiple clouds as well with comprehensive operating models that go across those. So, rather than starting to get confusion around sovereign clouds, we're bringing clarity to the market with our sovereign cloud initiative and a series of partners that can provide, both sovereign cloud advice and sovereign cloud services within different countries. And then the ability for our customers to truly, build a multi-cloud application or a multi-cloud strategy around what they're doing there, and being much more intelligent and thoughtful around where their applications and data are running, and making sure they're running in the most cost efficient, the most sustainable place, or whatever it is, and not being constrained as much by decisions maybe they made in the past. And then taking that all the way down through to providing the security across all of that, and making sure that people have the security insight to make sure that their data is encrypted at rest, for example, is encrypted in transit, make sure that when it's somewhere, we can prove where it was and how long it was there, and the security things are in place. And that goes all the way down to our end user. As you say, we've got quite a broad offering set, our end user offerings there, where we can actually make sure that we're securing that device that the user's consuming it on. So from a data perspective, we can enable you to make the best choice around where your data sits, where you're building the application that looks at those data, and then give you reassurance that data is getting to the right person at the right time and being secure in doing so as well. So it's, starting to help holistically answer all of those options, rather than sort of staring in the face and saying, I'd like you to come and use my cloud. It's that choice is really important.
Okay, and maybe I know you kind of coming up with the perfect methodology was maybe difficult, but for folks that are either underachieving or where they're underachieving with their data usage, interrogation, whatever. Or people that are aware that they need to be doing more with it or start doing something with it. Have you got at least one or two bits of advice as to where to start? I mean, do you start with one little area and then gradually roll out? Do you try and go for everything at the same? Just one or two thoughts as to how they can improve or start out on their optimizing data usage.
Completely. I think so. The way to not do it is to look at the data and stare at it and hope that something's going to come out of it and make you change your mind, or to start saying, well, let's get our data sets together and mine it and see what pops out. That's entirely the wrong way around to do it. Okay. The right way around to do it is to start with a business objective. You have to begin with an understanding the key questions you're trying to answer. What are the key business problems you're trying to address? And then once you've got those key questions you need to answer, then you need to start identifying the measures that will answer those questions. And this will start to focus both your data collection effort, but then the sort of mining and what you're going to do with it. So rather than collecting data for the sake of it, you'll start to identify why you need data, and then start going to get data to start answering those questions. This is, very much, look, you don't just read book after book and see what sticks, right? you go and look up what you need to look up and find the data you need to find to answer your questions. So that's very important. And then I think you need to come up with some kind of central corporate function around data management. We find a lot of organizations, when we look at them, have lots of duplicate sets of data, or even different departments going out and buying sets of data that are identical. So, you know, you need to have some kind of central data strategy, which is a very, very big step. But, you know, make sure it's led by outcomes, and make sure at some point you've got someone sat in the middle there looking at all the data you've got, which might be as a focus of that first project, that says, okay, fine, well, in future we don't need to collect that, and we should go and get that, and we should start collecting that. It gets a bit more interesting that way, but focus with what you're trying to decide on, rather than just staring at data lakes hoping that a fish is going to jump out.
Okay, well, it's been brilliant to chat to you today, Joe. Thanks for sharing a lot of very valuable insights. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Brilliant. It's been fun to chat. Thanks very much.